Welcome to the Filmlings Podcast,
a bi-weekly podcast where we analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Alex.
And this is episode 61, Wunderkind Welles. Which doesn't sound like an alliteration, but it is, I promise.
It's tempting to say Wunderkind Welles, but we didn't.
Nope. But yeah, we are talking about the one and only Orson Welles. There's a lot of stuff to talk about him, about his career, and about his work, because he had a very tumultuous relationship with Hollywood and the whole movie community, even though he was so devoted to it and so good at it. Is really an interesting dichotomy.
Yeah, certainly. He's definitely one of the most examined or well-known filmmakers out there. Who had a career that looked like it was going to skyrocket off into brilliance and didn't quite get there.
Not necessarily by any fault of his own.
Well, I was about to say, partially because of his own personality. Like, there was definitely people who had it out for him, but at the same time, Orson Welles loved Orson Welles and was, in certain regards, a combative person when it came to his own work.
But there was also a lot of really brilliance, circumstantial things.
Of course. I'm not saying it's his fault 100%, but it's not also 100% not his fault. So,
right.
But you know, the same brilliance that makes him a wonder kid also makes him kind of hard to work with at times. So it's interesting to see that. It'll be interesting to see that play out this week, and for anybody who wants to do their own studying into Orson Welles' life.
Yeah, especially in light of a lot of the themes that he covers and that we will be talking about today. But first of all, let's just talk about Orson Welles himself. He lived from 1915 to 1985, born in Wisconsin. Eventually, he, instead of going to college, decided to travel and went to Ireland and did kind of a painting tour. He liked painting, but says that he was never really good enough to make it big. And eventually, through this, he ends up in doing theater work and then doing some radio work, comes back to America, and at some point starts the Mercury Theater with John Houseman. And that a branch off of that is Mercury Theater on the Air, where this theater troupe, a bunch of radio voices and personalities, put on classical works, classic literature, and they turn it into a radio format. And the most famous/infamous of these recordings was their recording of War of the Worlds, which they aired it on Halloween and decided to kind of have a little fun with it and basically make it sound as if it were a live broadcast that was happening of these aliens actually coming and attacking. And this created a lot of buzz, maybe beefed up by the newspapers a little bit, because the newspapers were kind of struggling with radio and the distribution of advertising and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, it got a lot of attention one way or another, and Orson Welles started getting attention from the Hollywood community, who would keep pitching him ideas or pitching him deals for making films. And Orson Welles loved movies, he loved going to them, but he really didn't have an interest in making them. So he kept rejecting them. He kept making these outlandish stipulations and conditions to all of these deals that he thought nobody would ever agree to, until finally they did agree to his most outlandish claims, which was to give him basically full control over a film. And he gets that and makes Citizen Kane, and becomes instantly like a really huge name. There's some controversy after Kane, but he makes another film called The Magnificent Ambersons after that. During post-production on that film and his next film, there's a lot of kind of back and forth with the studios. And so really from that time through the rest of his career, he has a really rocky relationship with Hollywood, goes to Europe, goes back to Hollywood for a little bit and back to Europe, but really has trouble funding any of his films after his second big picture. And that's kind of the story of his career, is him taking acting jobs and just doing whatever he can to mostly self-fund a large portion of his career, especially towards the end. So that's that's basically how it goes. He starts off really strong with a lot of promise, and then, as you were saying, just personality clashes and these different things with the studios really just make it difficult for him to create the art that he wanted in the way that he wanted for the rest of his career.
Yeah, he was a self-styled charmer, a self-styled con man at times, and literally at one point became a magician of sorts, as we will talk about at some point today. A very interesting guy, a very big personality, and at points a very big guy, especially if you watch Touch of Evil.
And Chimes at Midnight.
He's very large. I meant to look it up. I don't know if he actually wore a fat suit in that one, but he's very large.
I think he did. He had a fascination with theatrical makeup, as we're going to see in Citizen Kane, really.
I believe it. Anyway, Citizen Kane is the first movie we're going to be talking about today, from 1941, which won Best Original Screenplay. It did not win Best Picture. It lost pretty famously to How Green Was My Valley by John Ford, which is actually a pretty good movie in its own right, but it's considered one of the biggest film snubs in Oscar history. It was nominated for Best Picture, Best Actor, Best Director, Best Cinematographer, Black and White by, I forget his name, but he's very good. Best Art Direction, Best Sound, Best Editing, and Best Music. Is currently regarded as one of the greatest films ever made, often ranked number 1. And it's kind of like a go-to film snob fodder. Like, oh, I bet you like Citizen Kane. You must be a film snob. And it's loosely based on the life of William Randolph Hearst, but it also pokes fun at other big-time business demagogue or business / wannabe political demagogues in U.S. history, which might be kind of relevant again. Look at that. Anyway, That's Citizen Kane.
Yeah, and our second film is Chimes at Midnight from 1965. This is in one of Welles's European periods. This is adapted from Shakespeare, but rather than being like a film version of a Shakespeare play, Welles takes the character of Falstaff, which appears in the Henriade, quote unquote, which is basically the last Richard play and the 2 or 3 Henry plays that Shakespeare wrote, and it just follows this one character and his relationship with young Prince Hal, and it's one of Welles's personal favorite works. It's also one of Peter Bogdanovich's favorite of Welles's works, which we're going to talk a little bit about, at least because, you know, we like to do interview books like we did with Hitchcock. And today we'll talk a little bit about the quote unquote autobiography that Peter Bogdanovich created with Orson Welles called This Is Orson Welles. Our
final film for today is F for Fake. From 1973, one of Orson Welles' latest and last films, and it's kind of a semi-documentary, kind of like a docudrama kind of thing, where it mixes together, and it's kind of this exploration on the trickery that goes into movie magic, and then just trickery in general. And in fact, it actually is Welles' last complete film, the last one that is done in entirety. There was a project or two that I wasn't able to finish, but this is, like many of his later films, after his falling out with Hollywood, produced and shot in Europe.
Yeah, all right, so that's what we're going to be talking about, and let us jump into the big one, the first one, the film that Orson Welles made when he was just 25, Citizen Kane.
Oh, wait, we just went through all 3 films. I thought we were done for the day, Jonathan. Are we not? I have something booked. Okay, never mind. Okay, cool. Citizen Kane. Citizen Kane from 1941. What to say about Citizen Kane? Well, first, before we actually dive into the analysis, we like to tell you some of the story that goes into it. And Citizen Kane is a story that takes place out of order. It is a story within a story in a lot of regards. And it starts with the death of the man who kind of takes up the entirety of the film, Mr. Kane himself, who dies at the beginning after mysteriously holding a snow globe and saying, "Rosebud." If you've ever wondered what that's about, this is what it's in reference to. And then promptly dies. And then the rest of the film technically follows a reporter who is digging
News
for...
on the march.
Yeah, who's digging for the story behind his final word and trying to shape out this literal character study of this man, this Kane figure, and trying to figure out what he's all about.
It's kind of great that we follow a newspaper reporter, because it's a good device just in general, but it's multifaceted here in this specific story.
It's a meta character study, and that the character study is happening on the level of the film and on the level of the reporter's search. And then, of course, within the reporter's search, as he meets the older version of each of these people from Kane's life, that person tells their story, and we go back into the past, and we see the younger version of that person and the younger version of Kane, played by Wells himself, as we see his life from a child whose parents strike oil or gold or something of that sort, and then send him off to be educated, so he inherits a fortune, and then he buys a paper, and he becomes a big wig businessman, gets married, cheats on his wife, tries to go into politics. That cheating on his wife undermines that goal, tries to force his mistress into becoming a famous singer. That doesn't work because she can't sing. But it's this big twisty-turny narrative that snakes along, and the audience and the reporter try to pin down like some kind of clear-cut definition of who Kane is over the course of the movie, and they think that Rosebud is going to be the pin that you pull and it all falls into place, but they can never figure it out. And at the end, they're like, well, I guess we'll just never know. But the audience is then told what Rosebud is in the very last sequence of the film. But even then, you kind of have to sit with it and wonder what Rosebud actually means. Is it a callback to his childhood? Is it a symbol of a simpler time? Is it a regret of the choices that he made that sent him down this path? So many choices. But it's nothing that sits pretty in a perfect little box over the course of the film. And of course, yes, this does kind of follow the life and times of William Randolph Hearst, who supposedly Orson Welles was poking fun at in this film, and was part of the reason why this film got buried.
Yeah, it was almost literally burned at some point, but we'll get to that. And do you know where the word Rosebud actually comes from, Alex?
Oh, I do know. It was actually one of the things that really pissed off William Randolph Hearst, and for good measure.
It's a pretty low blow.
Reportedly, it is the nickname William Randolph Hearst had for his mistress's word we can't say on the show. That's pretty. That's really ostentatious mocking of
and
man.
It's completely unrelated in the film, but just knowing that is really that's pretty low. That's even though they change enough and a lot about that, but also the fact that this film is made like contemporary to William Randolph Hearst. Like, he's not dead when this movie comes out. And the other thing is, this film was originally going to be, they were going to make a film about a different tycoon, which is Howard Hughes, which we've talked about a little bit before in The Aviator. And this is kind of, it's almost like a biopic that has just changed more than a normal biopic would in order to make it be kind of a standalone thing. But really, there are so many similarities that it's almost like The Aviator, one of these other biopics that we've looked at before, because they always take some dramatic license. This one just takes enough and changes enough names that I guess it's not technically a biopic.
Yeah, my thought on it has always been that it started, the basic idea of it was a biopic parody of a man's life, or a combination of a set of men's lives that was kind of being mocked and poked fun at by Orson Welles. But Orson Welles is also the kind of guy who just has idea after idea after idea. I mean, that's part of what makes him... that's part of what gives us the title for this episode, The Wunderkind. And those ideas are good, so it might have started off that way, but it became this piece of art that Orson Welles just molded and molded over and over until we can see that at its base it was a biopic, but it grew to become something more.
Yeah.
Which I think it's important that it got away from just being a biopic in order for it to become to have the lasting impact that it does. That and the
exactly.
amazing film technique that goes into it.
And aside from just kind of like poking fun at the way that these certain tycoons and these really huge personalities live, like not necessarily on a humorous note, it becomes almost like an American tragedy in a sense. And Orson Welles, coming from the theater, has a huge appreciation for Shakespeare and some of the great dramas of the world. So he's got a lot of that to pull from. When he and Herman Mankiewicz are writing this script, which is another controversial thing that we can get into later, but it kind of turns into this really grand scale look at hubris and the different love relationships that people have and the wrong reasons that people get into those kinds of relationships, and what they try to get out of them. And it's got so much just emotion and these themes of again, power and memory and love and honesty and pride, and all of it is just intertwined so well together into the story of this one man and all the fall off of his one personality, given enough money and power to do whatever he wants. That you're right. That's what elevates it to this movie that stands as, I think we've said before when we looked at Bicycle Thieves, that someone at some point claimed that every movie comes either from Citizen Kane or Bicycle Thieves, and we can see where like stories of pride and the fall and destruction after pride come from Citizen Kane, because it's just such a powerful story.
Well, certainly all of Christopher Nolan's body of work falls back on the structure that Citizen Kane has.
A little bit, because the structure is really kind of complicated, but also brilliant, because we start with this famous newsreel section where after Kane dies, we see these newspaper men creating this film newsreel of Kane's life. And so we go through like all of these highlights, all the scandals and the big things that he did, and they're all just really like skimmed through in about 10 minutes or so. And then we cut out and we're like in the editor's room, and they're trying to figure out what does this need to be more. And so then they go on this journey to figure out what his last words, Rosebud, means. And so, like you said, we go to each of these characters and they tell a story about a specific point in his life. So we end up jumping back and forth all over time, but we still have an idea of where we are because we've seen this big overview at the beginning. And it's really an interesting structure that you don't see that often unless it's like a gimmicky kind of thing or something like Christopher Nolan where he's trying to disorient you. But this is actually just a way to keep you knowing what's going on and where we are without having to keep himself cutting from this year and then the next year and then the next year and then the next year.
Right. It's not just a fancy structure for the sake of having a fancy structure or showing off. It's structured very deliberately to show you these different chunks and pieces of this man's life in a certain order, to build his character in a certain way.
Yeah, because it's almost in it's almost structured by like theme, like by parts of his life, and not necessarily by, this led to this in him, which led to this in him, which led to this in him. It's he had all of these within him, and this is how his pride destroyed him. This is how his love of love destroyed him. Or destroyed everything around him as well. And it's just like piece by piece until we get to the final tragedy.
Okay, so should we talk about technique? Because the cinematographer on this project, I believe his name was Greg Toland.
Yeah.
Yes, Greg Toland pulled off some absolutely amazing work on this project. There's a lot to talk about.
There's actually a funny story. Yeah, there's actually a funny story about Toland because, again, Orson Welles is straight out of a theater world, and Toland actually came up to Orson Welles and was like, I want to be your cinematographer. I've done a lot of stuff already, but I want to work with someone who's never been in Hollywood before. And who does your lighting on your shows? And Orson Welles is like, well, I usually do, just because I kind of need to fill in multiple shoes and stuff like that. So Orson Welles shows up on set and starts directing the lighting and telling everyone where to put stuff and everything. And Toland is just kind of walking around behind him and signaling people and like making little changes and stuff after Orson Welles goes through, until finally one of the grips or somebody on set goes, excuse me, Mr. Welles, like, that's supposed to be Mr. Toland's job. He's supposed to, place the lights and all that. And Toland was just really upset about it because he wanted to see what cinematography looked like from someone who's completely fresh, who's not tainted by the system and by all the pre-existing techniques and stuff. And so it's just kind of a funny way that Orson Welles kind of gets into this, and he has a really great relationship with Toland. Toland at some points offers to spend a weekend and teach him everything that there is to know about cinematography. And Orson Welles just really appreciated that because he says, what other cinematographer would admit that you can learn all there is to know about it in a weekend? And so there's just this really great rapport, and it seems like they feed off of each other really well because Orson Welles kind of has this very specific idea of where the camera needs to be at all times, and he has all of these ideas for these trick shots and all these kind of things. There was a lot of special effects and stuff that you don't even notice in this film. And Toland just goes and does it, and he makes all of these things happen that had not really been done before. And it all just kind of comes together really, really well. Yeah,
and we'll notice throughout all three films today that Orson Welles has a very unique, he has his very own ideas of where to put the camera that are a bit more dramatic than I think many other of his contemporary directors would have sprung for on camera placement. But there are a number of really cool techniques pulled off on Citizen Kane in particular. A lot of people like to talk about the very long tracking shot in which the camera moves through the roof of the building into the room below to see our characters. And of course, there's a whole a widespread use of deep focus in this film, where you close the aperture down a lot to get a very large depth of field, where you can
so that everything's in focus.
So that everything's in focus. But to do that, you need a whole lot of light. So they pumped in just gobs and gobs of light into these sets to make it work, which I can only imagine was incredibly hot to work under.
Yeah. And the other really famous shot is the part where Kane's friend Leland comes in drunk after something has just happened, and this is kind of like their friction moment, their butting heads moment. And Orson Welles on set was like, you know what? We need to get as low as we possibly can. And so as they're like on set ready to shoot, they dig a hole in the set, in the ground, and shoot up from below the floor in order to get like the most worm's eye view that they can possibly get, which is still an infamous thing. And then, like we talked about, this kind of, I was thinking about when I was rehearing this story, doing research for this, when Hitchcock kind of just dug out an entire basement for Rear Window. But, Orson Welles is just like, we just need this one shot. Let's just make this one shot as low as we possibly can make it.
I feel like every other week we're talking about how somebody dug a hole in a floor to get some shot. Or like
Apparently,
maybe
that's
I'm
how
just
you
hearing
make it
about
big.
it. Like it happened on West Side Story. It happened here. It happened for Hitchcock. Like everybody's digging holes everywhere. There's probably like a memorial trail you can follow of various holes. Like the hole tour. You can take the Los Angeles hole tour and go around LA and see the various holes that various filmmakers have dug for certain shots.
That's funny. But speaking of West Side Story, yes, I'm going to use that as a transition. The editor on this film is actually Robert Wise, who we've seen before, who directed The Day the Earth Stood Still. But he directed a lot of stuff, a lot of very different things that you wouldn't think of. And he kind of gets his start as an editor in films like this. And he edited a couple of Wells's films. And then at some point, I think it actually might have been on a Wells film, there were reshoots needed, like on Magnificent Ambersons, and Wise actually had to be the one to go out and shoot it, and so that kind of got him a step in the door for directing and stuff like that. So it's just interesting how all of these personalities were interacting together on this project.
Right, and speaking of collaboration, a lot of the Mercury... Oh my gosh, I can't say anything. Why do I bother? Mercury. A lot of the Mercury... I'm going to say it like that from now on. Sorry, guys. A lot of the Mercury theater cast actually followed Orson Welles onto this film, and a lot of people would become incredibly loyal to Orson Welles. And we've talked about that a lot in terms of, you know, directors having their own kind of like cadre of actors who will follow them around from project to project. But it's even more impressive in Orson Welles' case because he got kicked out of the industry more or less and booted all the way halfway across the world to Europe to kind of scrounge out a living, struggling to make each one of his films as he goes along. So the fact that a lot of people would follow him through that process is incredibly impressive and speaks to his levels of charisma and his legendary charm.
Yeah. Probably the most notable of the Mercury Theater cast is Joseph Cotten, who stays loyal and friends with Orson Welles throughout his whole career, and
but would also have his own pretty significant career in Hollywood.
Yeah, he was in a lot of things after this. But yeah, it's really interesting how pretty much the whole cast, along with Orson Welles, comes straight out of theater and radio, and they're all just kind of put on film. But of course, Orson Welles didn't really believe in like a stage acting versus a film acting, quote unquote, which are terms that are thrown around a lot. He just thought that there's good acting and there's bad acting. And also one of the things that he was kind of averse to, which is interesting for a director, is he did not do a lot of close-up shots. And he kind of jokes around about those and says that, anyone can act in a close-up shot. That's where you get to be melodramatic and you can see all the emotions and stuff on your face. And he said he would actually threaten his actors if they weren't doing well enough in a longer shot. He was like, if you don't pick it up, we're going to have to give you a close-up. But the other interesting thing about all of these actors and a lot of the technical stuff in this, coming from theater, this film is really also held up as basically a masterpiece of makeup, because all of these characters we're watching go from very young people to very old people, because we're catching up with them at the end of their lives. And the makeup all looks really good, and it's crazy because, Orson Welles is 25 when he does this. The rest of the cast is fairly young too, about his same age. And they make them up to be so old, and I think it really holds up even today. And the black and white helps a lot. And Orson Welles talks about how trick shots and different kinds of special effects and stuff like that really hold up a lot better on black and white than they do in color. At least at that time that he was working. I mean, this is debatable nowadays, but anyway. The makeup is really cool, and they're all like really fun old people, especially like Joseph Cotten as the old Leland sitting in a little rocking chair in a nursing home. So it's really interesting to see how good the whole crew, like everyone around him, was to bring this his first ever picture, ever time setting foot in Hollywood, and he comes out with Citizen Kane, the Citizen Kane of good movies.
Oh, jeez. Man, yeah. Oh, almost forgot about that saying.
Yep.
Citizen Kane, hashtag fun old people. All right. Okay, so we should probably talk about the fact that this movie was buried upon its release. Once they finished it, they cut it, and it started to go through the preview process where the studios would essentially test play it to various audiences. But also at that point, the studio executives would be seeing it put together for the very first time. They started to realize that they might get into some sort of trouble. All of the rich people were pretty connected, and William Randolph Hearst, among others,
still alive,
probably would have been pretty upset if this had opened to a wide audience. Unfortunately, due to some kind of contract negotiations, it still had to open in certain theaters, and it would open, I believe, in either an incredibly small handful or just one singular theater.
It was a handful because Wells says wherever it played, it did fairly well. Like the reception was pretty good wherever it played, in America at least. Apparently not so much overseas.
Yeah. It was one of those things where it did not get all of the marketing and all of the support and all of the widespread distribution that it needed to really be a commercial success, and effectively burying it as a film, which, as you can imagine, has a large effect on a director's career if that's what happens to your first feature.
Yeah, and I mean, it was almost burned because the fact that it does kind of pull from the lives of living people, but also it's a fairly dark story. And this is still near the beginning of like the noir era, so it was a little darker than people were used to, and so I think the studios were scared that audiences wouldn't like it, and all that kind of stuff. So they almost just totally destroyed it. It's kind of a miracle that the movie still exists, but now again we talk about this over and over and over again, films that have found their staying power over time and after the initial reaction to it from the public. And even just looking at the Oscars, people were it won a lot of awards because it's technically brilliant, it has a great story, the acting is fantastic, but Orson Welles is coming in from the outside. All these people are not kind of part of the establishment. And even the Oscar that it won, Bogdanovich talks about how it was almost more of a nod to Mankiewicz than to Orson Welles. And I think Orson Welles actually used that Oscar that he got as payment for someone working on F for Fake later on, because he really didn't hold any esteem to it because he got snubbed in every other category. So it's really just an interesting thing to see this film that tops charts today and was almost completely rejected by the quote-unquote Hollywood establishment in its own time.
Right. And yet he would persist in his career. It would not be the end for Orson Welles. There would be many more movies to come, and many more quite brilliant movies to speak of, including our next film, which our own in-house diehard Shakespeare fanboy, Jonathan Satchel. That's why that was his nickname in high school. We would see him coming down the hall and we'd all go, "Hey, no, it's Shakespeare Satchel."
Yep, it's a mouthful, but
yeah, he was always hurling about those old-timey insults. He was quite the villainous rogue. Anyway, next is Chimes at Midnight, also known as Falstaff. I'm not actually sure why there's two titles, or if there was a title in one country and a different title in another, but essentially it's just the life and times of Falstaff from the Shakespeare canon from 1965. And Jonathan, take it away.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it. It's kind of the life and times of Falstaff. But for those who are not familiar with Falstaff, go back to our Kenneth Branagh episode. Probably be bringing that up again. But Falstaff is this character in the English history plays that Shakespeare wrote, which are based on specific kings from English history, and specifically John Falstaff, who is kind of this. I'm not actually sure like what technically he is, but he's this huge personality.
It's not clear at all. Much like
really not.
Much like Orson Welles himself, he just kind of like is there because of the force of his personality.
Yeah, he really just kind of is defined by his personality, and he's always depicted. He like the character is this huge, very rotund, large, fat man who hangs out in taverns all the time, has people around him. He's the guy that's just making everyone laugh. He's got this huge, roarous laugh, and basically the young prince Hal, who hangs out at these taverns and is friends with Falstaff and all of these other people before he's actually king, and his father usurps the throne. So now he's prince, next in line for the throne, and he starts struggling with this these two parts of his personality. He loves these friends, these peasants, essentially, who just have a good time and drink and play all these pranks and all this kind of stuff. But he also has this threat of royalty looming over him. And we start to see him struggling with that even before his father dies. And then it all culminates in the time when his father does die and he takes over as king. And there is a climactic scene where Falstaff bursts into the coronation ceremony, and the new king has to totally dismiss his friend out of hand. And it's this really sad moment. But so it's really interesting to see how Welles takes this one character and this character dynamic between Falstaff and Prince Hal, and puts them in the center of this one story. And he creates kind of his own Shakespearean tragedy in a sense, not in like the grand scale of some of his other ones, but really he just makes like a little mini Shakespeare tragedy out of the character of Falstaff, whom he connected with a lot in some ways, I think. And I think Orson Welles always connects with his characters in a lot of his movies. There's a lot of them that reflect himself.
Right, and yet again in Chimes at Midnight we see this entire film is kind of a character study all over again, pulled from snippets here and there, told in flashback of a larger-than-life character, one with maybe not nearly as much power as Kane and Citizen Kane, but one with a hefty, no pun intended, amount of influence in the world around him, dealing with powerful people in the form of the royal family, which somehow this villainous rogue has come to be somehow close in touch with. I'm not familiar with the origin story of Falstaff, man.
And again, it's not totally clear in this
infiltrating in classic conversation origin story. Anyway, but yeah, no, it's fascinating to see this yet again become a character study, because it's not really a straight through narrative. There is no singular thing that's trying to be accomplished. We're really looking at the effect that I almost called him Citizen Kane, at the effect that Falstaff has on the people around him, especially the important people in the form of the young prince. And we're trying to figure out him as a character, and we're not even really sure of who he is the entire time. Like the opening kind of set where we see him and the young prince pull off this robbery of pilgrims going to Canterbury.
Which was really kind of a double cross from the start.
Yeah. Was he really scared? Or was he actually trying to spot the... did he actually spot and recognize the prince right away? I don't know. We'll probably never know. He's just that kind of guy. We don't know what's coming out of his mouth. We don't know if what's coming out of his mouth is a truth or a lie. We're not entirely sure of the motivations.
And he may not either, really.
That seems very apparent over the course of the film. But I think we can be sure that he does very much love and admire his friend, the prince, and very highly values their relationships, their relationship. And for what reasons he values that relationship, I'm not 100% clear. But we will we'll certainly find an interesting time to try to pick that apart as you watch the movie.
Yeah, and I mean, Falstaff kind of talks about how, hey, whenever you're king, you're gonna let us off the hook, right? You're good friends, you're good pals. You're not gonna hold these things over us, are you? And Hal's really like struggling with it, and he's thinking about it. And on one hand, I think Falstaff believes that he will kind of have this immunity, but that's not why he's friends with Hal. But it's kind of tragic because you're definitely put on Falstaff's side from the beginning. He's just such a likable character, and that's his whole point. But you also can't totally blame Hal because he has these responsibilities. He has this he has to do these things and uphold these things that is going to rule the kingdom. And the irony in all of this is that his father is so concerned with legitimacy, and he's constantly telling him to stop hanging out with Falstaff and all these people because he wants the crown to be legitimate. But the irony being that he usurped the crown, and he's not even the legitimate king. So there are all of these dynamics going into it, until the point at the end where, and again, I think we said this on the Brown Eye episode. There's no spoilers on Shakespeare at this point.
No.
But at the end, where Falstaff dies, and all of his fellow tavern dwellers are mourning him, and Hal's not even there. He may not even know. And we saw that whenever we watched Branagh's Henry V, which kind of takes the end of that relationship, and Hal remembering all of these old times and having to actually execute judgment on some of these old tavern buddies because of his new responsibilities. So we already know like where this is all going. We know that he can't remain friends with these people forever, at least not as such. And yet the fact that this relationship exists just creates this tension the whole time that we're watching Hal's development.
Right. And I've been thinking that this might be in some way, shape, or form intentional or unintentional. Kind of like partially an autobiography of Orson Welles. Especially in his later years, as he kind of assembled his own band of
it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy.
And outlaws, people outside of the Hollywood establishment, to make his own stuff on his own out in the wilds of Europe, so to speak. With young Prince Hal kind of being a stand-in for his relationship with Hollywood, which embraced him at first and thought he was brilliant, and then turned him out on his ass.
Yeah, it's actually an interesting thought, especially in light of moments like at the end of the battle when Hal kills the other prince, and Falstaff takes credit for it, and it's like, oh, I totally killed him. I got him. We fought so hard, and you knocked the wind out of me, but I got him. And Hal doesn't say anything. He just kind of lets it go. But then when it comes down to it, when he's face to face with him at the coronation, he rejects him and sends him away.
Yeah. It's there's some hard moments to watch where you really feel quite bad for Falstaff.
But there's also so much comedy in the film, because Falstaff is just an inherently comedic character. The arc of the story is tragic because we know how it's going to end, but Falstaff is just so much fun to watch. And when the battle starts and he's kind of just trotting along while all the other soldiers are marching and racing past him, and having to get lifted up on this contraption just to get onto his horse, and the role playing that he does with Prince Hal, it's just all so much fun. And it constantly though has these little foreshadowing moments, especially when Hal starts thinking about his father and the crown and stuff, and he just goes dead sober. But then he has this little twinkle in his eye at the end of scenes like that, and so you're never really sure. But it's just really an interesting character dynamic to watch unfold.
Yeah, twinkle in the eye is a good way to put it. I'm not entirely sure that Orson Welles wasn't and still isn't Santa Claus.
Yeah, especially in that Falstaff makeup.
Right. All right, now on to our last film of the day, F for Fake, or as it's known to me, F is for Fake, from 1973, which is a crazy rabbit hole of a movie, which Orson Welles takes us down after he's gone through his magician phase, which most kids go through in high school, but he went through in his 60s.
Well, actually, he did go through it when he was young, and he just kind of never dropped it, I think.
He relapsed. I understand now. Okay. But anyway, he takes us on a guided tour of fakery and con artistry in a multi-leveled storytelling that flits back and forth all over the place, and tells different stories. I wouldn't even start to tell you the order that it happens in, because we'll be here all day if I try to do that. But here are some of the big things that are hit. The idea of magic. We see magic as trickery, really. We see Orson Welles do several magic tricks over the course of the film. We hear the story of a painting forger, art forger, who painted, or at least according to Orson Welles, most of the famous paintings that now exist in many of the museums in Europe. And we also hear the story of the man who wrote a book about him, who himself was a con man of sorts. And we also have the premise that at the beginning of the movie, Orson Welles tells us that he will not lie to us for the next hour, but the movie's like an hour and like 13 minutes long or something. So who the heck knows what's going on in the last 13 minutes? You don't really leave with any sense of whether any of it is true. And in fact, I have no idea whether any of it's true. I don't know. I don't really care. That's not the point. But you are deeply entertained and allured throughout the course of the film. You get a little quick story about Picasso and one of his later in life muses that gets thrown in there. And you get utterly charmed by... Or do you? And you get utterly charmed by Orson Welles' personality throughout the course of the film. You also kind of get to see the crew that Orson Welles ran with in Europe during the early 70s, late 60s, when he was getting into the crowd in which he would learn the details of the stories that he relates over the course of the film.
Yeah, so there's a lot of interesting things about this movie. But first of all, this film is completely narrated by Orson Welles in front of and behind the camera, because we see often him sitting in this old cutting room, and shots are constantly jumping between just looking at the shot and looking at the shot through an old linear editing monitor, and he's just surrounded by these these reels of film that don't even mean anything. They just have a lot of colors on them and stuff like that. But yeah, it goes back and forth between all of these things, because essentially Orson Welles set out to make a documentary about Elmire de Hori, this paint forger in Italy or somewhere in Europe. And while he's taking all this footage that was started by another filmmaker, and then he was going to edit it into a thing, then the guy who was writing a biography about this guy, Clifford Irving, turns out that he had written a different biography on Howard Hughes, which turned out to be almost completely fake. And so Orson Welles was like, oh, wow, that's an interesting element to this. And so you've got a forger essentially writing a book about a forger, and is the book that he's writing about the forger a forgery in itself? And he literally goes back and forth through all of these things and just breaks it down, kind of, but also in a really disjointed and really fast way. This movie is so fast. that you're just like getting hit with information and names and people that you don't know, and you're going back and forth and trying to figure out. Oh, also Clifford Irving's wife, who is a faker herself, she forged an identity and was like in jail for it or something. So yeah, there's just all this stuff, all this stuff going on. But this all actually happened. Orson Welles set out to make this movie. All of these things happened, and then Orson Welles just incorporated it all into this completely new movie, which is basically the original video essay, which is interesting that the video essay has become such a popular kind of form of talking about movies nowadays. We reference them all the time on this podcast, and this is kind of where it comes from. There's even one by one of our favorite video essayists, Tony Zhao, who made a whole video essay about how F for Fake informed his creation of video essays. Anyway, there's a lot going on. And then at the end, actually, at the beginning and at the end, we're introduced to Oya Kodar, who was... He tells this story about how she was Picasso's muse. I'm going to leave that alone for now because she was really Orson Welles' muse towards the end of his life. And also, he kind of had this... affair relationship with her while Orson Welles was still married to his third wife. There's your bit of juicy Hollywood gossip. But Orson Welles even gave Oya Kodar her name, that stage name, and he brings attention to the name that he gave her in the movie. So there's just like so many levels of like fakery and things that aren't true that are just being presented as truth. And you really, like you said, you leave not really sure about anything by the end, but it's so masterfully constructed, and Orson Welles is so charming, and he tells you that it's all going to be fake at the beginning, so you're really not surprised, but it's just is a whirlwind of a movie.
Yeah, no, for half a minute I was like, I should really look up what actually went on with this stuff. I should figure out, what actually went on. I should do some Googling on these people in the film. And then I realized what kind of a mire bog that would have been to crawl in.
Yeah.
And,
because
step back and realize,
there is truth in there.
You know what? I was entertained. I took something away from that. I saw some really cool film techniques. I am happy with what I saw. And not knowing might be better than actually knowing.
Yeah.
Which is kind of one of the themes that you see in the course of the film.
Yeah, and like I said, there is real events that happened in there. There are like true things that happened, but it's just so convoluted and intertwined that it's almost kind of it's kind of a reflection back on Citizen Kane about how you're taking real things and mixing them with these illusions and stuff, but you're doing it in such a way that at some point that line between what actually happened and what is real and what is just made up in order to create a convincing story really gets super blurry. And Orson Welles talks about like his own career in there and just kind of like is like, oh yeah, so I created this radio program where I said that Martians were attacking and a lot of people believed it. That was fake. And so, there's all of these different things that Orson Welles is bringing together in this one just hodgepodge of, at what point do we believe something? At what point does it matter whether we believe something or not, or whether it is true or not?
In a lot of ways, it's a retrospective on his own career, which is fitting for his last complete project.
Yeah.
And kind of fits with, his charming, nearly flying by the seat of his pants personality.
Right.
And yet again, he manages to be a big character in his own film. That isn't even really about him on the face of it. It's about all these other people. But him as the narrator and as the crafter of the story, it's inescapable that he is a character in it.
Yeah, and also reflecting back on his own career, the fact that he kind of started off doing this painting tour through Ireland, and then he wraps up with a film about painters and fake painters who were painting for money because Elmire, the original forger that this movie was about, wanted to do his own paintings, but nobody would buy them until he started forging the master's paintings and selling them off as real, and then he found out that there was a lot of money in it. And literally Orson Welles traveled Ireland selling paintings just to make money and live. He literally like slept under his painting cart and stuff like that. So, you know, there's just so many different levels to this, and then reflecting it back in a meta way on Orson Welles, in addition to all of the meta commentary that Orson Welles is giving about himself. Again, it's a lot, and it's so fast. The cutting in this movie is like mind bending.
Right. It's it happens pretty fast in a very kind of slidey, lures you in and then whirls you around to trick you again type way, in the way that real sleight of hand actually functions, which is a nice thing to consider in the kind of like trickery and leading the audience around by their noses and then surprising them at the last minute that goes into all of film technique at a base level.
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting things about it is distinguishing it from a documentary, because we've talked about documentaries before, and this doesn't totally fit into that category because it's not. He kind of set out to make a documentary, but then there was just so many things that happened that it turns into more of a commentary than an investigation of a real person or event or anything. And I don't know if that's what kind of makes it more of a quote unquote essay than a documentary. It's just this idea that, you know, he's stepping back and commenting on what all of these pieces mean together, as opposed to just presenting something and letting us figure it out. But yeah, I don't know. I don't think it fits neatly into the category of documentary, even though it is more nonfiction than fiction.
Right.
So it's very interesting.
And with that, let us transition into overall notes. And what to say about Orson Welles that hasn't already been said, mostly by himself.
Yeah, really, he did. I mean, he literally asked Peter Bogdanovich to create the book. This is Orson Welles, which I'll add a link to in the blog post, of course.
Of course he asked him to. That's brilliant.
Yeah, because Bogdanovich had done this series of interviews with John Ford and created a book out of those. And Orson Welles saw it, and John Ford was one of his huge inspirations. And I think we talked about last week how Orson Welles watched Stagecoach every night for a month, getting ready for Citizen Kane. Not because they were thematically similar or anything like that, but just because it was such a good piece of storytelling. But anyway, he saw this John Ford book, and he was like, "Okay, can you do one of those about me, and just so that I can like set the record straight on all these things that people think about me, and then I could just kind of put it in my own words." But it's even interesting reading through the book and how many times Peter Bogdanovich is trying to get him to talk about things like Citizen Kane or like what he thinks about certain directors and stuff, and Orson Welles is trying to just constantly avoid answering these questions because I don't know, he has this really weird relationship with his own work and other people's work, and Bogdanovich does the best that he can to get as much information from him as he can. So it's a really interesting thing. But yeah, Orson Welles did. He had a lot of very different ideas about art and his own films and everyone else's films, and it's really hard to pin him down in that way. And that's probably a lot of the trouble that Hollywood had with him when he was working there.
And you know, it's interesting, actually. I was almost thinking about suggesting as a title for this episode, Obligatory Orson, because it feels like almost everybody has to study him to a certain extent. And he is one of those filmmakers with such a big personality and such a unique story in the film industry that a lot of ink has been spilled about him. And certainly, many minutes of audio waveform has been recorded on him. Can we make that a new saying? A lot of waveform has been wasted on somebody.
There you go.
So much waveform wasted on the guy, and in a lot of ways, you know, it's a little tiresome, and I certainly see a lot of people have that reaction to Citizen Kane who aren't really into old film. But, you know, there is still a lot to be gained from it by seeing, much like Greg Toland saw in Orson Welles, kind of an industry outsider who was brilliant in his own right, in his own way, and did things consistently a little differently. And you can see that, especially in Chimes at Midnight, in some of the really extreme angles that are just super bold. And it takes somebody with the confidence and the unorthodoxy of Orson Welles to commit to doing those consistently throughout all of his films. You can see there's a lot to gain from studying somebody who does it a little differently than the rest of the industry does.
Yeah, and even one of the interesting things about Citizen Kane that Peter Bogdanovich talks about in his introduction is that, it is a masterpiece in its own right, but there are other films that may be better in a lot of ways. But one of the most interesting things for film people to recognize in Citizen Kane is it's this young kid just discovering the medium, and he has all the tools and all the power and the storytelling skill to do it right. And it may not be perfect, but it's him discovering it and finding new ways to do things that hadn't been done before, and just doing it because he didn't know any better. He didn't know how things were done before. He would ask questions about things like Stagecoach and like, hey, how did they do this and stuff like that. But really, he's just going in there and trying to figure it out. He's got a solid story, and there's just a charm about that, about the freshness of the love for the medium and of all the things that he did. I think. And he even talks about how he basically took filmmaking the most seriously out of all of the things he would do. He loved theater and radio and stuff like that, but filmmaking is the one thing that he took really seriously and didn't want to do commercially. He wanted to do it for the art, and he made a lot of really great work. And yet he had such a tumultuous relationship with the leading industry in the world that was creating that art. And it's so interesting to look back on him, who left such a huge imprint on the scene after he died, to just see how tumultuous and how, I guess for lack of a better word, unappreciated he was in his own time.
Yeah, and he's certainly getting more than his fair share of appreciation now.
Absolutely. And I mean, it continues, and it may go back and forth with Vertigo for best film, but it's up there and it's on those lists. I think it was in the 25 inaugural films that started the National Film Archive, where they preserve culturally important and historic films. But yeah, the last part about, I guess, talking about Orson Welles in his entirety is the fact that because of all of these struggles that he had with the industry, there are a lot of projects that he never finished that he started. And it starts with like his third film, It Is True or something like that, that was made in South America, that he left for right after his second film, The Magnificent Ambersons. And that's really where a lot of those tensions started. But yeah, there's a lot of other ones. He did a Don Quixote project, which I think was finished after he died.
No one will ever complete a Don Quixote project without incident.
I know, right? There are just so many.
Literally trying to make a Don Quixote film is tilting at windmills. That's exactly what it is. Every single time anybody has tried it, it's just gone terribly, terribly wrong.
Yeah, but I mean, there's just so many projects that were never even finished. And it's interesting to think what would have happened if there were any relationships in Hollywood that he would have been able to maintain. And like, even if he was stuck at one studio, like Capra with Columbia, and was just able to like make something in like one environment, he didn't even have to go around. But it's amazing what he was able to do even without that, and just having to basically self-fund and kickstart, if you will, all of his projects.
All right, so next time on the Film Links podcast, we are going to be talking about mockumentaries. We've done a documentary episode, so we thought we might mock ourselves and do a mockumentary episode. And what films are we going to be talking about next time, Jonathan?
Well, Alex, how can one do a mockumentary episode without talking about the infamous, the famous This Is Spinal Tap from 1984, kind of the originator of this genre or mock genre or whatever. And then we'll talk about Best in Show from 2000, and finally a more recent film, and a fantastical film called What We Do in the Shadows from 2014.
Yep, the filmlings will be turning it up to 11 next week, but that's about all the time we have for this episode.
If you have movie suggestions for us or just want to reach out, I can be found on Twitter at @JSSatchel.
And I'm at Alex Garinger.
And to find links to things that we talked about today, you can view them on the blog at thefilmlings.com.
If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people know what we're all about.
We definitely appreciate it.
Talk to you next time.
All right, see ya.